This is why Rick Strassman called the DMT experience prophetic. The type of mystical experience that you have is a similar type that people had in the Bible, where there's a sense of prophecy. There's a revolutionary energy to it. I'm tuned in to the world mind and the way that history is flowing. It taps us into also a sense of predestination from coming from a culture that has basically been like, it's all random. You're random. This is random. Nothing means anything. This is all a dead machine that works like a clock. We just haven't figured out exactly how the machine works yet, right? This kind of hubristic, completely wrong approach. If you take DMT, it really makes it hard for many people to feel that that's a satisfying explanation of reality. Because just the feeling of maybe there is a greater order to the universe, maybe there is some sense of destiny. Well, it's part of what we need at this time in history.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. I know you, like me, have a probably just unscratched itch, a unsoothed, throbbing ache to know the answer to some of life's biggest questions. And I'll be honest, if I didn't figure out how to channel that psycho-spiritual existential angst into a vocation, I'm really not sure what I would do with myself, because I don't think that is a feature that many employers look for. I know my previous one did not, but, and I know I've got another banger in my Memedex for this point, when those questions are beyond reaching, the best you can hope for is bigger questions, mind-expanding experiences that contextualize you through, not answers, but turning up the volume on the mystery. And of course, there are many paths to said psyche-stretching experiences to living in those bigger questions, but I'm not sure any are more profound than that little molecular consciousness nuke that is DMT. And as we just talked about a couple weeks back with neuroscientist and DMT researcher Dr. Andrew Gallimore, this compound is unique even among psychoactive molecules in its profundity, in its alienness, in its ability to seemingly connect us with other worlds, other intelligences, beings. And though all of that is infinitely interesting, there are many more massive philosophical questions that sprout off of this topic that we just didn't have a chance to get to with Gallimore. And there's no one better to do that exploration with than my friend Alexander Beiner, because not only is he a decades-long consciousness explorer, he was in the world's first extended state DMT trial at Imperial College London. This is the one you've been hearing about, I'm sure, on other podcasts and other articles if you're interested in this topic, where participants were kept in a straight-up alien realm, longer than pretty much anyone ever outside of some, cowboy underground setup or classified programs that probably have to be going on, right? But I digress on that particular speculation, at least for now. Incredibly, Ali was also just part of yet another extended state trial, this time with 5-MeO, which is a whole fascinating conversation in its own right. We do get into it later on in this mind meld. He's got a book out that I truly cannot highly recommend enough. It is called The Bigger Picture. He's also one of the people behind one of my favorite YouTube channels back when it was active, Rebel Wisdom. He's got a fantastic Substack. Links for all of those will be in the description. Links for everything you need for Third Eye Drops will be down there as well. On the note of this media vessel, do me a favor, my friends, tickle that algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. It is truly of the utmost importance. Make sure you click that bell icon as well. And I should also remind you, we've got hundreds of mind melds in our audio-only back catalog with many brilliant beings. So do subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to podcasts. And if those big questions are still yanking at your wonder whiskers, join us over on Patreon at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. Not only is it the best way to support the show, we are riffing over there all the time in our patron-only Discord server. We do patron-only book club and what I call Wonder Gym hangs, where we just get together on Zoom and riff once a month, sometimes with a guest you've heard on the show. You can also get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. But presently, let's meld minds with Alexander Beiner. The friendly vibe mixed with the lifetime of experience and education. It's really one of my favorite harmonies. Always just love these riffs with you, man.
Yeah, that's really kind, man. Thank you. And likewise, back at you. I mean, these are my definitely some of my absolute favorite conversations, partly because they rove across so much territory, and that's just always a joy.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to. Otherwise, it's boring. And it's, especially when, not to sound like, oh, I've been around this block so many times, but I mean, I fucking have. There's however many hundreds and hundreds of podcasts. And there's a level to which it's like, of course, I love talking to people about their expertise and whatever, but I don't like the feeling when there's like guardrails on a conversation. Always does nerf it to some degree. And you're one of those people I can talk to where I'm like, I truly don't know where this is going to go. Like something completely orthogonal could just blast its way into this dialogue and take us somewhere that I cannot foresee. And that's always exciting.
Absolutely. My last time we had that speck of dust that sort of appeared.
Oh yeah.
Well, so literally in the room as well. And,
it looked like an orb. Yeah, for people.
Like,
yeah, that's right.
Kind of wild. But yeah, no, similarly, I've been doing this for some years, and I've noticed that, obviously I think all of us have that sense of like an emerging conversation, which is fresh, alive, has a life of its own, is always more interesting. And I've interviewed, politicians and sort of very traditional academics, and you really get that sense of like the guardrail, especially politicians will not go outside the guardrails. And so the conversation is almost like in this kind of well-worn rut. And it's always most interesting when there's this, breaking past those barriers. So I'm totally up for wherever those waters might burst through.
Well, speaking of well-worn ruts, you've probably talked more about DMT than anything else. You've in a lot of ways built like your social media profiles around it. And it's a pretty fun rut to be in. People like you and Gallimore kind of establishing, putting not just camping in that rut, but building, weather resistant structures in that rut. You've done that, and rightfully so, because I won't make you, rehash the whole story about you participating in the study at Imperial College. But that said, it's impossible for me not to talk about. It's impossible for me not to bring up, because one, people are so interested in the topic of DMT, and two, I still don't think we know what it means, what it is, how best to think about it, and what the implications for reality are with everything that it entails. And I wonder, so one, again, I'm sorry for dragging you back down this rabbit hole, but two, I wonder how your thoughts have evolved about it over time, if they have. Like, one of the questions I posed to Gallimore is like, what is it? And, and his answer is he likes to think of it as a technology, and a technology specifically that connects us to this something else, this other intelligence, this other realm, dimension, whatever it is. And once again, I don't think we figured out what it is, but do you have a way that you think about it? Have your thoughts evolved about what it is?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like, yes, they have, and also no, they haven't, which I know is not a very satisfying answer, but I'll try and explain why that is. Like, I mean, firstly, no, it's interesting. Like, just on your point about, having done a lot of content and written about DMT, kind of, if it hadn't been for that study, so I was on the, people haven't seen maybe the previous conversations we did, but I was on the Imperial's DMT extended state study. So I was one of 9 people to be injected with intravenous DMT for around 40 minutes we were part of the dose finding trial as well. So we got injected a lot more than everyone else. And it was absolutely fascinating, profound, life-changing in many ways. And my book, The Bigger Picture, is really about how psychedelics can change society rather than just our minds. And I use sort of sections of my dosings as a way to bring to life some of the bigger sociological, philosophical ideas I'm exploring. And so, yeah, my social media is full of DMT content, but it's funny because the rest of my work is very much more in the sort of sociological, looking at pop culture, understanding what are the deeper threads running through culture, what's going on in the zeitgeist. The media channel that I was one of the founders of, Rebel Wisdom, we were really focused on the meta crisis, what the sort of the overlapping crises. And I talk about that a lot.
So glad we solved that, by the way.
Yeah, that was worrying. Done, thank God. We can all just relax.
Right.
But so it's felt at times that I have these two pretty different strands. Like I have my Instagram and TikTok, which is and my to an extent my book, which is full of DMT inquiry. And
not literally.
Not literally. Yeah, it's loaded with DMT.
That's a special edition.
And then I have my other side of like my journalistic life and my Substack in particular, where I'm looking at the rise of the far right. I'm looking at the sort of the underlying mythic and occult aspects of Trump, or I'm looking at what we can learn from TV shows and movies about what's going on in the collective unconscious. Really quite different, and yet at the same time not different, which is kind of the point I'm getting to. Whereas in a sense, a lot of what I've been interested in is transformation.
Yeah.
And also the idea of this idea that we are culturally stuck right now, globally, and especially the type of civilization we have is running out of road. And when that is the case, you need, as Kuhn pointed out, you need a paradigm shift. Like the entire way that we're thinking, the whole way we're seeing things, the way we're talking about problems, the way we're approaching problem solving in general is the problem. And when that's the case, nothing you really do until you break your frame and get out into a different reality, nothing you do works, because it's all just the same part of the same dynamic. And I think we see that in politics, especially, where it's just this kind of rehashing of an old system on its sort of last legs. And even when you have a kind of revolutionary resistance to the system or a kind of a populist response, even that is just the flip side of the coin. And so I'm always interested in, what does it really mean to break into a completely new reality? And of course, we don't know that. We don't know what that looks like. We haven't lived it. And so we can, but I think in a sense, we can feel the edges and the contours of it within culture. And DMT just throws us right into it, or into some version of it. And that is one of the things that's so incredible about it. And also, like you pointed to, Gallimore, I'm sort of with Gallimore in the sense of it being a technology, but that does imply a bunch of things. It implies that it is crafted in some way, that it is something that's created as a technology, as something we create. But I don't know if I agree with that. I don't know if I disagree with it either, but I think there's a lot of burden of proof on that as a concept. But in the sense that it is something that takes us somewhere else. Like a portal, you might say. And actually, in my DMT experiences, portals have featured really heavily. And I know other people's as well, this sense of sort of Rick and Morty style, sort of being able to jump through different places. We have, wormholes, exist. And so this idea that you can go from one aspect of reality to another, or travel great distances in a very short space of time, is something I think is related to the DMT experience.
Yeah. I would love to hear you say more about that. But I do recall you telling this story about a sort of innocuous scene of like a playground or something serving as a portal, or as like a threshold or the waiting room or whatever. Yeah. And what that really reminds me of too is that I think it's overplayed in terms of the actual evidence that's there. The comparison between NDEs and DMT, like everybody wants to make that connection, which I do think is interesting. But the researchers that have really studied the evidence mostly seem to downplay that. But what I do think seems to harmonize, at least, is something that you're alluding to, which is that there are these things that are both a combination of imagination, like your own personal experience, your own imagination, communing with this exogenous factor that comes in and completely, perturbs the Umwelt, right? Where there's something innate in your, what I'm trying to get to is that there's something innate in your own imagination that creates the symbol it needs for it to function as this thing. And you may not, and it's seems like it's from the unconscious. It doesn't seem like people are making a conscious choice. Like in this case, using this playground example, it's like not like I'm going to, in this sort of, I was trying to think if there's a movie that does this, but I can't think of what it is off the top of my head. I'm gonna have this be like almost like an Inception type thing where it's like, this is like my symbol that I'm gonna use for this, that's gonna serve as that. And it's not conscious, but it does seem to be doing that. And that is also something that seems to be happening in near-death experiences where people or things appear to you in a way so that you make sense of it and you know what it is. But underneath that, there's a sense that's like, that's not what the way I'm seeing this is not really what it is, but it's serving this function it needs to serve. So it's like and it really, I've never thought of it this way exactly, but it reminds me of Hillman's The Dream in the Underworld to a degree, because one of the things he talks about in that book is that when you're having a truly archetypally derived dream, or a dream that really connects you to the archetypal, that archetype is going to be wearing a mask. It's going to appear to you as a teacher, as a lover, or a woman you're attracted to, or, whatever it is. But if you really stop to analyze what archetypal territory you're on, then you start to begin to get a sense of like, oh, this is the lover archetype. This is the mother archetype. This is the Senex archetype that's coming to me wearing this mask. And I wonder if that resonates with your experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, it does. I mean, it very much does, in the sense of there is a phenomenon happening that most people experience as real, as in it's not just my imagination. There's something real happening. My experiences have consistently suggested that the form being taken by what I'm seeing is not the real way they look, or the true form of what I'm encountering. So I think that Hillman example is spot on. The one difference is, are they archetypal energies, or are they sort of freestanding entities? And can that both be true at the same time? That's a whole other question. And, the thing is with these DMT experiences, we don't know. I mean, it's this beautiful, incredible mystery, right? We have absolutely no idea. And the whole thing's up for grabs. You could take a reductionist neuroscientist approach and be like, yeah, this is basically your brain, where all the processing is effectively upside down. Your brain is seeking to make meaning out of the experience. And then they make the argument, and, Chris Timmerman and others of conversations I've had with them, they made the argument of like, dream characters can be very, very convincing, convincingly real, and seem to have agency as well. Now, I think there's a qualitative difference between dream characters and DMT experience as well, which is quite real. The other thing that's interesting is that, back to your point about near-death experiences and this idea that DMT and near-death experiences are linked. I make the argument in my book that's probably not the case, or that the evidence isn't very strong, and that's based on the work of Dave Luke and Pascal Michael, who did a paper on that and said, look, it actually has a lot more similarity phenomenologically with the UFO experience, which I think is also true.
Yeah, that's a super.
For example, like I have never heard someone. I'd say an expert on the DMT literature and not on the NDE literature. So I just want to caveat that. But from my understanding, I have never heard someone come back from a near-death experience being like, yeah, there was just like crazy geometric patterns dripping from the walls, and then this insect sort of penetrated my head and downloaded something into me, and then this happened and this happened. It's usually there's these consistent things of a life review and a white light, and an encounter with loved ones. One of the things, I was speaking to Chris Timmerman recently. Chris Timmerman has run a lot of DMT studies at Imperial, and Lisa Lewan and him did the study I was on, and he pointed out that actually we were talking about like, well, what is like really distinct about the psychedelic experience?
Yeah.
Even if you could even say that entity encounters are something that people report in non-psychedelic experiences, and they report in dreams and visions and hauntings and other paranormal activity. he pointed out that the imagery, the geometry, the actual psychedelic imagery is completely unique to the psychedelic experience. I thought that was kind of cool. I mean, incredibly obvious in retrospect, but at the same time, I thought, yeah, that's interesting. So kind of back to the form of things, I've often wondered about DMT and psilocybin and LSD. I'm like, why does it look like this specific? Why these kind of images? Why this kind of geometry, this kind of fractal patterns of all the ways it could look? Why that? And that's actually just more a question I'm posing. Yeah.
I have some thoughts on it, and I apologize to the audience because I've gone down this rabbit hole to a degree probably the last few podcasts, because ever since I came across the idea, it was one of those things that just really gave me goosebumps, because I'm like, this is something that's like filling in something for me that was missing, that I intuitively kind of understood, but I had not heard discussed in this way. And what it is like this Greek concept that Proclus, the Neoplatonist, talks about, of symbolon, which is the root word of symbol, and synthema. And I know you're familiar with this idea of, correspondences. And this gets into the question that we were talking about too, about like, are the beings freestanding, or are they archetypal, or are they somehow something else? And so this addresses this in two ways. One, the answer could be both and, because if we do live in this universe of correspondences, and we're entering this realm of whatever you want to call it, like of nous, the mundus imaginalis, whatever it is, if we're entering that realm, there's whole like taxonomies of things going on there, right? And if they're freestanding, perhaps they're also archetypally related. And I haven't really explained to you yet what these synthema and symbolon are. And the idea is that essentially these are the divine signatures that are on everything that exists. And in a way, it tells you what that taxonomy is. It tells you like, this is he uses the most famous example of this is when Proclus talks about this idea that all things worship their god. And there's this passage about how heliotropes, flowers, sunflowers, like worship the sun, like they move and they follow the sun. And selenotropes do the same thing. They move and they follow the moon. And like that is essentially them worshiping their god. And think about what the geometry at the core of a sunflower looks like. We're talking about golden ratio. We're talking about flower of life. We're talking about these things that once again are signatures that are all over the psychedelic experience, right? And I kind of wanted to interject when you were saying that these experiences seem to be unique to the psychedelic experience. I think the volume on them is turned up, but I do think it's possible to see that geometry and even those perceptions at work. Like we've probably talked about this example before, like when you get roused out of sleep suddenly and you have these like very psychedelic, like sort of fractally things going on the periphery of your vision, and they very quickly sort of like dissipate. But I mean, I've seen that, I don't know, dozens and dozens of times just being woken up out of sleep. So I don't know. I mean, and of course this is just me riffing and plugging holes and prognosticating here, but it's enough for me to think it's interesting. It's interesting.
Definitely. This is an interesting point, because I for example, in meditation, I've had the kind of geometric imagery I had on psychedelics, not as intense, not nearly as intense, but certainly present, like in a deep meditation, or to a degree in breath work as well. That's come up. So, but I think what I'm trying to point to as well is like there's a unique quality of the psychedelic experience, like an essence to it. And actually, the example you were just giving of everything worshiping its own god, it's like, well, as you were talking about it, I was feeling like, everything has its own isness, like its own essence to it. Like every tree, every rock, every person, everything. And there's something about, going back to DMT, the isness of an NDMT. Like, it's got there's there's something about the experience. I think one of the reasons we're so fascinated with it is that there's a very strong sense that there's a there. That it's like there is I am now somewhere else. I am in something else. But what's interesting about DMT is that we retain our agency largely. It's not like 5-MeO DMT or other, types of, say, meditation practices where there's this experience of the ego dissolving. And this is why Rick Strassman called an NDMT experience prophetic, because the type of mystical experience that you have is a similar type that people had in the Bible, where there's a sense of prophecy.
Yeah.
There's often a sense of, people come out of ayahuasca journeys needing to do something in the world. Like, there's that meme of like, oh, ayahuasca told me. Right. That's this kind of revelatory process of I'm receiving wisdom, I'm receiving prophecy, and it can also be embedded in history. Leo Roseman talks about this. Like, there's a sense of like, there's a revolutionary energy to it.
Yeah.
Right? There's a kind of sense of like, oh, holy shit, I'm tuned in to the world mind and the way that history is flowing. So it taps us into also a sense of predestination, which I think is really, really important. And I've talked about this with Josh Fry, who does the Emerald podcast. This is something he's covered a lot. Like there is a sense in the West when we have coming from a culture that has basically been like, it's all fucking random. You're random. This is random. Nothing means anything. This is all a dead machine that works like a clock. We just haven't figured out exactly how the machine works yet. Once we do, then we will have mastered nature in some way, right? This kind of hubristic, arrogant, completely wrong approach to the world that we're still saddled with. And if you take DMT, it really makes it hard for many people, not all, but it makes it hard for many people to feel that that's a satisfying explanation of reality, because just the feeling of, holy shit, maybe there is a greater order to the universe. Maybe there is some sense of destiny that we're all enacting and part of. Yeah. That is what we need. Well, it's part of what we need at this time in history, because we're rudderless and pointless, and it gives point and purpose. So I think that's one of the reasons it's so popular, right?
Pardon the interruption, my friends, but I wanted to tell you about AG1. I first started using AG1 because, I'll be honest, my vitamin stash was getting absolutely preposterous. And I came to the realization that I could just replace a number of these by starting to drink AG1. So that's exactly what I did. And ever since I've started, I've absolutely noticed an uptick in my focus. And it makes sense because AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that supports your body's universal needs like gut optimization, stress management, and immune support. Since 2010, AG1 has led the future of foundational nutrition, continuously refining their formula to create a smarter, better way to elevate your baseline health. And not only did I replace a number of vitamins, I got those gut benefits, those prebiotics, those probiotics. One of the other reasons I love recommending AG1 is that they have a team of doctors and researchers that are working on their formula. They're constantly upgrading it. I think they're on like 52 iterations. So I'd say that if there was one product that I had to recommend to elevate your overall health, it would be AG1. And on that note, I'm so glad to welcome them as a sponsor. So if you want to take ownership of your health, it starts with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3 and K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. But do be sure to use our link, that is drinkag1.com/third eye drops. Again, drinkag1.com/third eye drops. Check it out. And back to the mind meld. For sure, man. Yeah, I just don't understand how you can't come out of a profound, and not just DMT, but a profound psychedelic experience and remain fully atheist, reductionist, materialist. Like, I get how you can come out uncertain, because it's not like letting the Mysterium Tremendum come in is just like going to answer all your questions. It's going to give you questions that you didn't even know you could have. And that, at the very least, I don't understand how it doesn't just open this ontological Pandora's box of just like, what in the fuck is this? And I'm like, all of it. So I'm absolutely with you on that. And we were talking about before how having this conversation essentially leads you right into this mystery of what does it mean to be alive? What things are alive? Is everything alive? Is there a spirit to things? And before we get too far away from it, one of the things that really made my wonder whiskers pop up when you were talking there was there's the isness point. And one of the things I riffed on, or attempted to riff on, in that Plato's Cave video I was telling you about, are you familiar with Plato's divided line, like the four kinds of wisdom thing?
No, refresh me on that.
So the Greek words are akasia, pistis, dianoia, and noesis. And roughly, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I've talked about it so many times, but akasia is essentially, so these are related to levels of the Plato's Cave allegory. So the shadows on the wall, these are like akasia, so that's like opinions, people's projections. Pistis, that's usually translated as faith, but it's not just like the Christian kind of faith. It's the sort of faith where you're putting your belief in something that is fundamentally unknown or false. And this equates to, in the cave allegory, the flame that is projecting the shadows onto the wall. And then dianoia, this is related to like the mathematical, rational, logical function. And it's akin to when the prisoner gets out of the cave for the first time and he's seeing like forms in the world and reflections of actual quote unquote objects. And then noesis is when he sees the sun for the first time. And the sun is supposed to be this symbol of ultimate, overwhelming truth. And there's a whole thing about what the sun is. Like there's this whole simile of the sun that Socrates tells before this. So there's a little more to it. But essentially the idea is that you can reach this ultimate kind of knowing of anything that is really overwhelming and is the true essence of it. Mm. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it, that because what is DMT? It is a pure distillation of a very simple, very psychoactive molecule. So in a sense, it's like you're giving yourself a pure hit of something's isness. And what is that something? Well, I don't think we can say for sure what it is, but we know it's like ubiquitous throughout the natural world, right? So it's like you're giving yourself a pure noesis in some sense of like one of the most fundamental mysteries of nature, right? Of existence, due to its ubiquity, at least in my mind. So that just occurred to me, and I've never quite thought about it in that way. And now riffing further on this, Plotinus, the most famous Neoplatonist, considered the founder of Neoplatonism, who was this deep contemplative, argued that all things on some level are a noesis. There's a noesis of every single level of reality, every single being, everything. And reaching those levels of awareness have this basically this unique experience. And it's like, but it's an experience it's not sense based, it's not logic based, it's above all of that. It's like being in it. It's like, that's one of the things that's so hard to communicate about what the esoteric layers of Plato's Cave entail, because the answer is like, you just got to be there, dude. You got to experience it. But it's so true, right? It's like, especially with something like a heroic dose or whatever, it's like, I can't tell you what it's like. Like you got to be there. Like otherwise, it's just it's all just broke ass low bit rate, just attempts, right?
Dude, oh man, that when you said the isness of something, but we don't know what the something is. That's really that I'm really enlivened by that, because I feel it puts me in new territory, and I'm just kind of with it right now. Like there's some, because we know, like you alluded to, right? DMT and tryptamines in general is really ubiquitous in nature. And it's a very simple molecule. I was like, what, is it chemistry itself in some capacity, right? Like, it's just kind of trippy idea, I mean, because I'm working with Bruce Damer at the moment on Minds, is his creative sort of nonprofit set up to investigate psychedelic creativity and problem solving. And so I'm really thinking a lot about that, but also Bruce's whole background is he studies the origins of life. And he had this ayahuasca journey where he got this big breakthrough to a major theory that then came out about the origins of life. It came from ayahuasca journey and, made it to the cover of Scientific American and is now one of the leading theories about where life came from. So it's sort of, the whole Minds project is very much like interwoven somehow with the origins of life, which is really why I wanted to work with them, in part because there's something very deep about that, and something very deep about the idea of us and all of our experience being interwoven with chemistry that used to be inanimate, right? Which was, there's
in quotes,
in quotes, right? But you have these, there was these other theories of like panspermia that McKenna was pretty into, right? Like you get the sense of like, maybe the origins of life came on an asteroid, and maybe that is true. But as far as I understand it, the theory that Bruce and his colleagues put out is one that sees us arising from matter, right? Like life, and it is, again, this is something Josh Fry has talked about in the Emerald. Like the line where you draw animate and inanimate is very arbitrary, right? This is sort of like, well, now it's walking around, so it's animate. It's like, well, what about plants? Yeah, but they're not animate, but they're alive. Yeah, they're alive, but they're not. Are they conscious? Well, yeah, maybe, there's just like, you get it. We just don't, our current model doesn't really have an answer for that. But there is something about tapping into something ancient and yet also familiar about the DMT experience. And that is actually all psychedelic experiences, I think, to some degree can have that quality. But yeah, it really does connect us with the possibility that the world is alive.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then it's not a lot easier. It's a little bit easier to start talking about the DMT experience. Because if the world is alive, then being able to change the way you're seeing, and this is really common in indigenous cultures who use, ayahuasca or DMT containing snuffs, this idea that the distinction is between what you can see and what you can't see. But for example, there's spirits in the trees. You just can't see them unless you've smoked DMT or taken tobacco. Doesn't mean they're not there all the time. And Jeremy Narby points this out, like where it's quite hard for us to understand in the West from our metaphysics and spirituality. We have like spirit. Something is sort of like dead until the spirit comes into it, and then it's alive. And that's really different. And the other model being like, no, it's all alive. It's just you are tuned into different things you can see. Actually, we know from cognitive science that's kind of the case. We're filtering out, Huxley was kind of right with the reducing filter of our consciousness. We are focused on relevance and ignoring what's irrelevant to us. And we're kind of selecting for that. And so, I think somehow DMT and other psychedelics, we know that people take DMT and psychedelics and come back reporting that they think the world is more animate, like to quite a high degree, even to inanimate objects. Like I think Johns Hopkins did a study on this, and I think even things like coffee cups, like something like 50% or so, people can check the paper, but like 50 or so percent of people were like, yeah, coffee cups are animate, and it was way higher for trees, and on rivers and things it was like way higher. That's fascinating. And so this is actually something I wanted to touch on before, that, so I'm glad the thread has come back around, but in this bigger question of like, okay, is the world alive? Do we live in an animate world, or do we live in the dead world that scientific reductionism tells us that we do? You ask the question of like, how can people have these experiences and come back still atheistic and still reductionist? And there's a couple of, like potential answers. Like the answer of, say, the new atheists, who many of whom are now converting to Christianity, but hilariously. But yeah, so the answer of that sort of like Sam Harris style new atheist was like, unless you are a reductionist, you're all fucking idiots, and everyone except for us is completely deluded, which is a very religious position, right? It's sort of like everyone's wrong and we've got the truth. And so the other possibility, or another possibility, so I think there's a bunch. Another possibility is like that the percentage of people who go into these experiences and come back being like, nah, it's all my brain on drugs, not entertaining anything else. They are just intensely resisting that possibility because of their training and the way that they see the world. And I know from, my wife is a psychedelic therapist, and I know from, both her work and other people's that the placebo can, so usually we're like, it's really, really obvious what's a placebo or not in a psychedelic clinical trial. But actually there are people on those trials who get the psilocybin, for example, and the clinicians are like, that's probably the placebo. And they're just resisting like very, very intensely, even if they're not necessarily aware of it. And I've actually had people on retreats several times come up and be like, they're with their pupils really wide. They're like, I'm not feeling anything. And it's like, oh, cool. Okay. Well, maybe just sit with that and just be with that and see, just it's a really nice time to maybe. My colleague Natasha Pilgrim has like genius response to that, where she's like, maybe it's just your body's way of saying it's time to have some rest. And there's nothing to really look at. And it's fascinating to watch because as soon as there's permission to not be trying to get somewhere or not be trying to see something, very often there's then an opening that happens. They lay down and then like the whole trip unfolds. Or the next day you hear the report and you're like, yeah, that's a trip, man. You've had an experience. But I guess my point is not to underestimate the level of resistance that we can have to seeing the world as something different than we've been told it is.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much I want to riff on in everything you just got into. One that I want to touch on is I love Damer. I had a lot of early TED episodes with him on. So I've had a bunch of conversations with him, and I don't want to like overstep my knowledge of his ontological take, but this idea that, either we did come out of matter, the ground of the earth, whatever, there's a lot of people who are more spiritual that would reject that, right? That would say like, no, there's got to be some purpose. There's got to be some teleology involved. There's got to be. My view of this conversation has changed a lot. And I think, John Vervaeke's like transjective take helps to some degree, that it's like, yeah, of course it's bottom up. But bottom up makes no sense without an attractor. Like unless there's some kind of, and he likes the Platonic terminology of like the one or the form of the good or whatever, as do I. But I go further than John in that I do think that there's like what we could call spiritual, archetypal, immaterial realms that are truly at play, and that in some sense are more basic and more superior. And then I'll clarify by what I mean by that, that cause the bottom up growth of life forms. And what I mean is, like, if you look at the work of someone like Michael Levin is this cutting edge biologist who's studying like how organisms self-organize, and then what happens if we just like interfere with the bioelectric intelligence layers on flatworms and stuff, and we move their eyeballs around. And like basically what he has figured out through a sort of, from my understanding, a sort of like negative kind of reinforcement. It's not even negative reinforcement, because it's like he's interacting with something. He's interacting with some kind of intelligence that's self-correcting and responds to the feedback that you're giving it. And it makes no sense to say that is just that organism's intelligence, because it's too smart to be a worm, right? It's too smart to be like, there's this agency, this architecture unfolding that he actually calls Platonic. And I've heard him even use the word Pythagorean in another interview. So it's like, I think there's a way that it can be both, and that actually not even to have the truth, but to start to approach the truth, you got to be like, how is it possible that both this is true and this is true? Like, because if I can create a scaffolding there that is more than bias and more than just, seeing what I want to see, then I think you're actually getting closer to the truth. Um, and yeah, I mean, there's so much more I could say about this, but I won't take it any further because I've already been rambling a lot. But
I was just thinking about the origins of life that you were just
mhm,
describing, it, and the sense of this sort of underlying teleology, order, purpose
mhm,
to just the process of the universe itself. And I don't know, it just strikes me that we are pretty much the only, or probably one of the only cultures we know of who have suggested that it's not the case, that there's some
right,
kind of order, teleology, intelligence to the universe. That, like, and I think I've been thinking of Terence McKenna again recently, and his this quote has gone around a few times in light of recent sort of political events, and the attempted assassination of Trump, and that's just the weirdness and unreality of that.
yeah, so
Of,
unreal.
McKenna talking about in whatever it was, like 1996, he's like, things are going to get weirder and weirder as the complexity intensifies, and as he saw the universe as this novelty selecting and ever complexifying process that's selecting for novelty. And then, that things are going to get so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. And I think because we're in that
Yeah,
era now, people are rediscovering McKenna, which is amazing. And so there is this sense of the rational edifice that we've built around the intense intelligence and strangeness of the universe is breaking through it. And, I have this theory that I call the age of breach, which is really about the way the internet acts as a mechanical unconscious, and our unconscious desires, sort of mimetic energy goes into the internet, and things like QAnon sort of ferment and form and take
yeah,
on a new life, and then they breach into the real world. And so far, they have an impact on the real world, like January 6th, like holy shit, or all the various weird things increasingly happening. But then they don't really last, because in a sense they're not fully formed. They're of a different realm. They're of the realm of symbolism, desire, fluidity. Online, anything you really want to be true can be true. Your identity can be whatever you say it is. But actually in the real world, in a lot of ways, your identity is defined not by your own egoic desires, but by the world itself.
yeah,
It's a very uncomfortable idea, I think, for individualist cultures, and likewise, your fantasies about taking over the country, they don't really last when you're in the reality of the sort of the embedded system. And so that process, I think, is somehow a sign of things to come, in that, like, the center cannot hold, and we have to bring in, like you were speaking to, like an understanding that isn't an either or. It's not a top down, bottom up. Like, either there is some kind of order or there isn't, but something completely different that understands the hidden order, but in a different way.
yeah, yeah. The whole riff about reality being this novelty selecting phenomena. I mean, it's so compelling. And what's so eerie about it is that one interview where he really goes into it, as far as I know, is very close to his death. So there's like this whole, there's this whole lore that stems from the ancient world about how when you're close to death, you have this mantic ability, like you have this seeing ability. Like Socrates talks about this before his execution, that he's like, I'm already something of a mantis, like the Greek word for seer. And now that I'm close to my death, like he basically he does a couple of things that are kind of mantic. One of the things is he sort of makes predictions about his accusers having not great lives and like things happening to them. But putting McKenna in that spot where he's in that interview I'm thinking of, where he's sitting in the jungle and he's really
Yeah.
talking about like, it's just gonna keep getting weirder and weirder, like that whole thing.
Yeah.
He's obviously so right. And in some sense, there is nothing to do but talk about it. But the thing that I think he missed, and I've been talking about this kind of a lot recently too, because I've been diving back into a lot of Robert Anton Wilson, like
Mhm.
Cosmic Trigger was like such a huge influence for me in my, like, whenever I first came across that book in my, I think it was my 20s, but I was rereading it to just see like, how does it land now? How do all, because have you read that one?
No, I know all of it, and I've read sort of bits and pieces, but I haven't read it cover to cover.
I think you'd love it just because
Yeah.
you would relate so much to it at this point in your life, like as somebody who's had a lot of high weirdness experiences, but
Yeah.
you're also, I mean, man, he was doing the exact same thing that we're doing now in a pre-podcast, pre-internet world where he's collecting this multimodal, scientific, esoteric, psychedelic worldview where he's like friends with Leary, friends with Alan Watts, taking a bunch of LSD, taking a bunch of mushrooms, like experimenting with ritual magic, experimenting with different meditation techniques. And he's just coming back and trying to collect it all in this postmodern way, and not postmodern in the like dismissive sense, but just I am a modern being grappling with all of this shit. And, you know, his big takeaway was always to remain agnostic and realize that you're in a reality tunnel and you're not going to see reality as it is. And how this relates back to what we were talking about is well, you for sure can't disagree with that take. One, I don't think that actually, I think that sidesteps the question of reality. It doesn't eliminate the fact that there is something true and there are these mysteries that point to something true. It's just that you can't get to them. But I think that that's a cop out, because what I think you can do is, in that sort of John Vervaeke kind of way, is engage in true, what he calls anagoge. Like you
Yeah.
can identify the direction of truth and just keep getting closer and closer to it through using all of your faculties. Or you can not. Or you can just be like, oh, we'll never know. It's all whatever I want it to be, you know, and just go with whatever your bias is.
Well,
And I think those are two very different things that lead to two very different outcomes. One brings you closer and closer to some kind of coherence and actual wisdom, and one doesn't.
yeah.
And I think part of the reason why, as you were pointing to, a lot of these people suddenly 180 into like something like a traditional religion is because they just want coherence so fucking badly. Like they want something. They're like, I know there's not nothing. I don't know what there is, but I know the world's just getting too crazy. It's getting too novel. It's getting so far. It's there's so much ontological shock going on. I need something solid. I need to just like put my faith in this and let it. You know, I'm going into it, and that's. I mean, there's so many people I think that just doesn't feel right to. You know,
Mm.
like it doesn't feel right to me. I don't think. I would guess it doesn't feel right for you. I would guess it doesn't feel right for a lot of listeners. And that's why I'm just so personally into this middle path of thinking there is higher truth, thinking there is a higher reality, thinking there is something that we could call God. There is something that we could call spirit, but it's nebulous. It requires constant course correcting, constant nuance. And it's like the only thing that you can get to, the only way you can get to it is through a sort of like negative theological bend, in like being like, it's not this, it's not that, it's not this, it's not that. And in doing that, you create this negative space around what it actually is, and you sort of get this very blurry idea of what it is through experience, through study, through being, through constant engagement with it. um maybe that's the difference between like a philosophical path and a religious path. I don't know.
Yeah, the difference maybe between like what Jung called a religion and a creed. You know,
Mm,
true religion being that sort of deep inquiry nature, being, and the creed just being like you go to church on Sunday because it gives you that coherence and that order that you're looking for. You mentioned postmodernity, and I think there's something to what you were just saying. There's a useful frame that I found. You know the pre-trans fallacy? Have you heard of this?
I don't think so.
It's from Ken Wilber's integral
Okay.
studies. But it's probably the most useful model Integral came up with. I think it ties into what you were just talking about. Like the idea is that and I'm going to link it to postmodernity or try if I can keep the thread, but like the idea of the pre-trans fallacy is that let's say you have these kind of three positions. You have the pre-conventional tradition, then the conventional perspective, and then the post-conventional. So, for example, let's take like relationships. Pre-conventional is like total dependence. I'm totally dependent on others, like a baby, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then the conventional one is like, no, I'm my own person. I'm independent, right? I mean, I don't need other people. I'm independent. I'm my own person. And then as you get older and more mature, then there's a recognition of, actually, I am dependent, but it's not the same type of dependence as the pre-position. The dependence of a mature, self-actualized, individuated adult who is dependent on the community and is equally also independent in many ways, and is a part of a rich, thriving ecosystem, and they're, dependent on the ecosystem, they depend on and they have an understanding and humility around that. It's a really different position, but they're both dependents. And so this is the pre-trans fallacy, because people look at one thing and they're like, oh yeah, but that's you've said the same thing. So very often the post-conventional perspective gets confused with the pre-conventional perspective, because they both sound the same, but they're actually really, really different. And it requires a level of wisdom, nuance, practice, understanding, and patience to understand the difference between them. And I think we're going through a similar thing with postmodernism, or the idea of truth itself, right? So you have the pre-conventional of like, yes, there's truth, and it's my truth, and or my religion's truth, and everyone else can fuck off.
Yeah.
And then you have the conventional, the perspective now, which is, kind of where we're at socially with postmodernity. Like, there is no truth. So we have post-truth world, but we also have like, whoever you say you want to be is the truth of who you are. There is no arguing with it. Everything is effectively meaningless. There is no ground of being for all of this playing with identity and ideas and the whole idea of truth. There's no ground of it. It's just like fucking chaotic swill. And then you have the post-conventional perspective, which is like, no, that's what you were just voicing. There is such a thing as truth. There is such a thing as there's a nature, there's truth with a capital T, and there is also the ability to cohere around something beyond us that is also real.
Yeah.
Right? Now, it's really tricky because of the pre-trans fallacy to hold that position, because then people are like, oh, what, like a kind of God in the sky? And, so you're like,
right, of course, yeah.
You're consistently like trying to explain the position that you're holding. And it's kind of exhausting as well, and everyone will have an example of this, because usually it's something you have thought about a lot. So it could be like music, could be, whatever. We all have that kind of example where we're holding a more post-conventional, position and compared to pre. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is something we're going through socially at the moment, where we know that conventional position that we're now in, of there is no such thing as truth, and everything is just kind of chaotic, upside down, postmodern madness. What Wilber calls an aperspectival madness. There is there's no solid perspective you can take, because they're all equally valid. And as Wilber points out really cleverly, like there is no truth, but of course the fact that there's no truth is a truth. So it's completely paradoxical.
Right.
All the way down. It's completely nonsense, right? And there is no way to run a society or to have real coherence or real connection and compassion with one another from that position. It doesn't work. And so then you get some of the new atheist types, like, and there's a few of them, like, either toying with or directly just converting to Christianity, because they're like, okay, we were wrong with our particular position, so we're going to go back.
Do you know of any off the top of your head who have done that?
Ayaan Hirsi Ali is probably the most high profile one, who was sort of there was like the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and she was sort of the fifth, like the horsewoman of the in New Atheists.
Always
right?
leaving out the ladies. That's how they do it.
Leaving out the ladies, yeah. But there's also just a lot of people who aren't like big names in that space, but might have a podcast or so. And there's also even people like Jordan Hall, who's a brilliant thinker. He he's got a very beautiful story of his conversion and why. But Jordan was looking for a religion that's not a religion, and he did a few recordings with John Vervaeke around this, and they were in conversation around that. And then was like, no, it's Christianity for me, which is, I get it, and I respect it, but I think looking at it socially, what I'm really interested in is it's not a solution for where we move forward as a collective. We can't, I don't think it's a solution to go from, okay, this postmodern mess here in the middle in the conventional perspective, it's not working. Let's go back to pre-conventional and just be like, you know what? It's all fucking explained by a religion. Yeah. As a psychonaut, I can't do that. I just can't do it. I try. I didn't really try, but I kind of have really sat with it and been like, should I just do that? Should I just go full Zen or, whatever it might be?
Right.
Well, like, I love Zen. I've learned a lot from it. I love Taoism. I've learned a lot from it. My outlook is really Taoist. I'm like, should I just do it? Should I just go fucking full Taoist? And I'm like, nah. And I feel like you're probably the same. It's like, it's just not, it just doesn't feel like the truth to me. It's maybe lots of truth, but it's not the answer. Yeah.
And this is again why I'm just becoming such I've never put it this way, but such a dick rider for Platonism, because it's just like it gives you both. It gives you all of it. It gives you there is transcendence, there is divinity. Those things are not separate from the world. They're in the world. They're all over the world if you know how to see them, if you know how to recognize them. And as you progress in your journey, and this is where I think we've lost whatever that the progression means, because I think there were very likely initiations. I think there was like an esoteric vein to Platonism, and there's scholarship on this that by people way smarter than me who have spent their whole lives researching the fact that there are clearly unwritten doctrines in Plato, and he's constantly pointing toward different Pythagorean wisdom that you only get through initiation. And we know, he went to Eleusis, all these other things. But there seems to be this recognition of the bleeding importance of all kinds of wisdom. And that one is not, you can't dispense with any kind. Like, you have to have the rational education, the math background, the geometry background, and somehow that increases your ability to appreciate the mystery when you do experience it. And that they're all like backwards and forwards compatible because they're all part of one tightly knit reality, right? And I love that. And it's also extreme. And it also, another thing I just love about it is it highlights the importance of dialogue, right? That there are these kinds of truths that you can only arrive at through interlocutation with other people who are seeking truth. So yeah, there's just so many things about it that I love. But I guess I would give credit to religions in that I think they can evolve too. Like they can evolve their understandings of what their truths are. And clearly, you see, if you just look at the Catholic Church of 1,000 years ago versus today, we could probably, if we were scholars of this, we could probably list like hundreds of doctrinal points that they've softened on or changed or something, right? So they can evolve to some degree and maybe provide an important foundation at the same time. So I don't write off religions or think they're wrong or think that anybody shouldn't belong to one. I want to make clear that I'm not saying that. But for me, I'm with you. I can't justify why I would belong to this and not that. Why I would, put my faith in this text and not that text. And that is a postmodern, I suppose, perspective that I can't do away with, is that I see in a sort of perennial philosophy kind of way that there is important wisdom in all of these paths. And there's like a golden thread that runs through all of these wisdom traditions and religions. And I love and appreciate all of it, but I'm also not going to prostrate myself to only one in particular and discount the others. That's another big problem for me, I just can't do that. But I do think that leaves a giant hole. And one of the holes it leaves for me is ritual, how to think about things, what to call things, because I do think that these things are important and serve a function. And I've played around somewhat extensively with some of them, but there is still always a part of me that feels like I'm LARPing. There is still always a part of me that feels like it's like, I'm just doing this now. And I wonder how you've grappled with that, because I know you've tried so many modalities over the years too.
Yeah, I mean, grapple is definitely the right word. I find this absolutely as well. This is such, and I think a lot of us have this experience who might consider ourselves like spiritual but not religious, right? Which I hate the term, but I don't know where else I really fit into it. But you know, it's exactly that. It's, you know, the respect I have for established religions is that they have those tried and tested frameworks and forms and ritual structures that allow for a connection with the divine. And I think there are a lot of different ways to connect to the divine. I don't think they're all the same, and I don't think they're all roots to the same type of experience, the same kind of understanding of divinity. But I think there's many paths. I'm not like a sort of generalist, sort of like, oh, it's all equally valid or it's all equally the same thing. I don't believe that. I'm not really in a position to say what's valid or not in terms of spirituality, but in terms of like at least valid for my own quest, let's say. And so, yeah, this question of, I think you put it well, LARPing, right? Like, how do you, like, for example, you know, a death, a birth, a life transition, you know, a lot of us, you know, I'm very happy, you know, having been raised Catholic, to engage in that form of ritual. I don't feel a contradiction in that. I can see the beauty of it as well, because also in want of a different model, it's also a social thing. It's embedded, and it's a way of processing collective grief. I was at a family member's funeral, older family member's funeral a few years ago, and it was beautiful. It was very Catholic. It was in Ireland, and afterwards, I had this sort of download for, you know, started thinking about like, how would I like my funeral to be, or how my, you know, and I had this kind of download for concentric circles of people, because you have these different lives. So maybe on the very outer circle is like people you worked with. And then on one of the circles inward from that is like your friends from high school and college. And then the inner circle, another inner circle is like close friends who you've known for like, you know, most of your life, or otherwise meaningful. And then the very inner circle, like your direct family. You have like concentric rings.
And then in the very, very, very center, me, right?
Yes, that you're there. You have to be there for every funeral. This is where it all falls apart.
Oh shit! Okay,
I have to clone you.
Sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of cloning. So in the middle you have the deceased, and then having a process where you have the different rings taking turns to talk about the person. You know, probably you start with the you know, I don't know, maybe I don't know how you do it, but you'd have them like moving in or moving out like that until you get this real rich picture of the life. And then the other thing I really like is, what's his name? The guy who wrote Ender's Game.
I don't know off the top of my head.
Anyway, Orson Scott Card, I think. The sequel to Ender's Game, he used to work as a funeral director, right?
Oh, wow.
Or in a funeral parlor. And the sequel to Ender's Game is called Speaker for the Dead. And it's a sci-fi book. And the main character basically goes to he's a speaker for the dead, and he goes to different planets, and he learns about the person's life over like, you know, a few weeks or months, like does interviews with people, really like gets to grips with the person in their fullness of exactly who they were. And then he gives a kind of, the kind of neutral, just honest accounting of the person to the audience. So it's not this sort of like, they were the best person in the world. They were this, they were that. It's just like the truth of who they were. So the reason I bring that up is like, it's kind of awesome to imagine new rituals. You know, there is something beautiful around it. And I think we kind of should as well. And then at the same time, you're up against, you are kind of LARPing, right? But almost someone was LARPing at every stage of every ritual we have. You know, like you could argue that it came from a deep connection with the earth or with place or with source, and it emerged naturally. I don't think necessarily it was always some guy being like, whoa, okay, well, if someone's getting married, I'll just fuck around and make this up. And you hold this stick and you hold that stick. I think it's a bit more of an emergent process, which is it's part of a complex social system. At the same time, so is just us riffing on what a new funeral might look like. That's an emergent process. And then it would work in the same way as all these processes do. Someone would hit on something that's just like, holy shit. Everyone's like, do you know what? I just need to see that happen. right? That's how all of our great ideas come around. But it doesn't happen if we don't actively. Okay, so I mean, the final thing I'll say on this, I think what's coming up for me as I'm talking about this is like, many of us sort of like crippled by this problem. Like, we don't want to have traditional religion. We don't want to larp something stupid that feels inauthentic and has no roots in the human experience and no roots in place and no roots in history. And so we just sort of stuck with the old in a way, and we don't really want to create the new. I think in some sense, what I would like to see is actually probably first a conversation around it within the spiritual communities and communities who are into kind of weird shit we're into, and presumably a lot of people listening or watching are into. Just have the conversation of like, okay, what are we going to do? Like, what's a good way? Like, what's a good way? Because we need ritual. We need good, solid, deep ritual. So use the best of postmodernity in a sense to crowdsource that and create a creative emergent process around it. Because I think right now it's kind of stuck.
Absolutely. Yeah. So one, you and I need to get started on an integral Jungian psychedelic Neoplatonism book of some sort that will solve this problem for everyone. But two, yeah, man, there is this little voice in my head. Like, sometimes I literally will be laying in my bed at night thinking about like, man, I wish I had like a ritual I did every night that I felt connected to, and every morning, and all of this stuff. And I know that there are probably some that I just need to actually make a habit of trying into. But there is a voice in my head that's like, make up your own rituals. Make up your own rituals. And that's exactly, I mean, that is what Jung did. Jung kind of like deconstructed, like what is ritual? And then he got eventually to active imagination, where it's like, you do something ritualistic, almost to just, man, what is the word? Temenos, I think. Is temenos the word that means boundary? I think I could be wrong, but it's like you've got to do something to demark the boundary that you're entering the sacred space, and you have to have some practice that gets you into the sacred realm or the unconscious or whatever you want to call it, and then you have to have some way of doing your work and recording your work when you're there. But that also that's also something different though than it, because I think we need like prostrating type rituals too. Like, I think we need rituals that are just like, just being like, thank you, or I need help, or just like these basic, I'm in a dialogue with the transcendent, the mystery, and I acknowledge you, I thank you, I bow to you, I need help from you, I want to connect with you. Like, I think that is just such an innate basic need that people have, that they cut themselves off from when they really don't need to. And it may not, like, maybe you do that, like if you did that right after this podcast one time for 5 minutes, where you just sat down and you just really tried to think about that and be in that, it may not make that much difference. But if you did do that every day, because this is sort of a part of the practice that I've cobbled together, it does make a giant difference. And there's some kind of qualitative unburdening that occurs that I think is really real. And maybe just sitting there and meditating would get you there too. But in my experience, you tell me your experience on this, because this could just be me. I natively slip into that. Like, if I'm just meditating for long enough, I start slipping into that sort of like, thank you, just that sort of gratitude disposition, or depending on what's going on, that I need help kind of disposition. Is that, maybe that's like a Western, vaguely Christian sort of indoctrination or something, but I don't know.
No, man, I think slipping into an I need help and gratitude position is like, for me, that's what prayer is about.
Yeah.
Like, I think prayer is, I wrote a piece on this last year about making the argument that prayer is the practice that helps us recognize the limits of our agency. And
Right.
that's why, and so, but I get into detail about like the different types of prayer and etc. But fundamentally, I think it's such a powerful practice because of that. Because consider like that in a culture that's like, sky's the limit. You can just manifest everything. You
Right.
basically you hustle hard enough, you can have anything you want, which is not true. It's got truth to it. It's, you know,
Right.
it's not untrue completely, but it's really a completely different orientation to recognize I'm not in control of, because the world is alive and I'm not the center of it.
Right.
I'm a part of it. And the other thing that came up for me as you're talking is, you know, Byung-Chul Han, the philosopher. He's a Korean German,
sort of. I
yeah,
know the
and
name.
he's real. I wrote a piece. I'll read out a little quote from him because it's really, really relevant to what you're saying. Like he has a book called The Disappearance of Ritual,
Oh.
and he basically says we can define rituals as symbolic techniques of making oneself at home in the world. They transform from being in the world into a being at home. They transform rather being in the world into being at home. They turn the world into a reliable place. They are to time what a home is to space. They render time habitable. They even make it accessible like a house. They structure time and furnish it, right? So there's something of ritual that, you know, he also makes the argument that effectively neoliberal, sort of late capitalism forces us out of that mode of sort of being at home in the world because it's for sort of forever consuming time in a sense,
Yeah.
right? So it's like, and so where you're talking about that coming home to oneself and then tapping into an experience of, oh shit, actually, for me, it's basically like, wait a minute, I'm slipping out of a world that tells me that has massive demands on my agency at every single moment into a sense of at homeness on the world. And I think it's fascinating that I also have that experience. When I come into a sense of at homeness in the world and I'm sort of situated in time and place, I think as well, what comes up is a sense of openness, humility, and I'm not in control.
Yeah.
In fact, my agency is not what it appeared to be. And there's a really great, my favorite definition of ego, the ego, it comes from egodeath.com. It's Michael Hoffman. I don't know if you've ever come across that. It's a wild website. Oh my God, that's a whole other story. But he has this argument that he's like, what the ego is the part of you that believes it has control across time. I'm like, quite like that as a definition, right? Because it's not the sort of, it's not just the me, because I also have a lot of issues with how the ego is defined in sort of spiritual worlds and whatnot.
For sure.
But that part of us that's like, okay, I'm going to have to hustle and graft and strategize in the world in order to sort of manifest into the future, which is a really useful capacity to have, but it's our entire society. Like that's the entire impetus of the world we live in. Continuous growth, continuous forward motion, go, go, go.
Yep.
And so it's kind of insane, right? And I think what you're talking about is a remedy to that. I think it's the inner voice being like, surrender.
Right. It also, this directly reminds me of Hillman's riff on the Hermes Hestia dichotomy. Have we talked about that ever?
No.
He was talking about that at some point, presumably in the ancient world, there was this understanding that you needed these different archetypal forces to balance one another. And he has this great riff on how we're in the time of Hermes Mercury right now. Like Hermes, it's just like, go, 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 information, more, do this, do more, grind more, be more, like elevate yourself, go past thresholds, go past boundaries. But when you have that unbound, it creates all kinds of problems, obviously. And we can't be a being that's doing that. We need rest. And Hestia is the archetype of home, hearth, rest, feminine, still like stillness. And we obviously need that. And we need to learn how to appreciate that and ground in that. Like, I guess there are some introverted people who might need more of the opposite, but I think most of us are coerced into being in this way where we're like, way too little of that Hestia archetype. And I totally agree that just by being in that kind of a space, it up regulates that kind of
Right.
humility and gratitude for me. Like whenever I'm just still, I mean, like I said, I always either slip into this place. Most of the time it's gratitude. It's like almost like a meta meditation type of like, just thank you for this, thank you for that, thank you for this person. Um, but also sometimes depending on what's going on, like, man, I really need help. Man, I really need direction. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Um,
As a small aside, in my counseling training, there was a model we looked at, which sounds really bizarre, but actually really works, about asking for help. Right? It was actually, we were working on the father wound, and it was actually based a lot on the, do you know, the diamond approach? Come across like
I think
AH,
only you and I have talked about it, I think.
yeah, diamond approach. People haven't come across it. It's sort of a school of spiritual and psychological inquiry. It's kind of a mix of depth psychology, Sufism, and a whole bunch of other
Wow.
modalities. And their practice is, the main practice is called inquiry, which is a kind of talking meditation. But it's also got a really interesting model. It's got based on what's called a theory of wholes, which is pretty Jungian in the sense of like, there's a kind of natural spiritual essence that we have. And through the world, through growing up and through just interacting with the world, the ego structure and the personality structure sort of has to compensate for the inability to express that essence, right? And so, and there's they have different levels of it. And in the white, as they call it, this kind of essence that's related to support. There's this exercise where the argument was like, if you can't ask the Father for help, right? The Father archetype. If you can't ask the Father for help, you can't ask the Divine for help, right? And this is not to denigrate the importance of the Divine Mother and the Divine Feminine, but it's equally important. This is specifically about help and support, and it's mad because it's really, really effective. So you can basically, if I'm in meditation, I'm asking for help. And I run men's work retreats, so I know how much stuff people have with their fathers, and it doesn't matter. It's not so much about your relationship with your father. Of course, that might come up, and that might need to be processed, but it's about the father archetype. I'm lucky to have a good relationship with my father. So, when I did when I do it, it's just instant, where there's a sense of, oh shit, I feel supported, and then I ask the Divine for help. One time I did it, and my dad, so fucking crazy. I did it sitting on a bus. I was just like, I don't know, I was going through something difficult, and I was meditating, and it was during the training, so it was like really fresh, and I was asking my father for help, and then I received an email like 10 seconds later from my dad to me, my brother, and my sister, saying how much he appreciated and loved us.
Wow.
And that's an unusual email to receive. I don't know, maybe, it's not that he's emotionally cut off. It's just, I don't know, he's maybe sent 2 emails like that in our lives,
Wow.
And I wrote to the therapist who was doing the training. I was like, dude, this is nuts, right? So I don't know if that's helpful for anyone, but it's worth trying. It's worth just having an open mind and giving it a go, because I found it very powerful.
Wow. Yeah, I intuited that that's where you were going, somewhere like that. Like you were in that state, and then you had this crazy synchronicity with your own dad. And yeah, man, that's one of those things that really, that really feels like a kind of cosmic sympathy, doesn't it? Because it's like you're pulling on the archetypal thread of the father. You're like deep in that sort of mind space, and then suddenly your physical father sends an email like that, which and then also just thinking about that, you must have both been occupying a similar psychic space at the same time, because clearly he had to be writing the email, and then maybe he was writing the email before you were even thinking about it, and him thinking about you could have somehow in some non-local way caused you thinking about him. And then, it's just crazy, man. It's
wild
stuff like this is so unbelievable. Just this morning, I had a mini version of this with my friend Colin, who he's just a close friend. He's the person I went to Peru with a few years ago to drink ayahuasca, just somebody I look up to a lot creatively too. And I was just like thinking about him this morning, and it was just like a dumb text that I sent him. And it was one of those moments where we literally texted each other at the exact same time, just like that kind of stuff when it happens, just is so creepy and amazing in the best possible way. And it again, just kind of like points to a lot of these things that we're talking about and around, is that there are these different kinds of knowing, being, like experiencing, that we don't understand, but you can have experiences of them. And just because we don't understand them or what they really are doesn't make them any less powerful or real. And that's I think that's one of the core insights that it's important to arrive at in a knowing kind of way on a regular basis. Because for me, at least, and I'm guessing this is the same for you, just saying it or talking about it doesn't make it felt. You've got to have experiences of this stuff. And I think, again, that's why ritual is so important, because ritual, ideally at least, gets you into these places where you do feel these archetypal needs. You do meet these things wherever you are. And yeah, if we don't have that, it's just a noticeable lack. I wanted to bring back the thread of actively entering the mystery, though, because a lot of the stuff we've been talking about since the DMT conversation early on has been very practical, very philosophical, very not just intellectual, but I think there's a lot of stuff you can sink your teeth into there too. But I think it feels, to me at least, like there's something very different about actively going in to the mystery, the mysterium tremendum, the wave of just like a fractal, sentient, I don't know what, and everything that we're talking about. And I wonder, as someone who has done that so many times and tried to integrate that so many times, you were talking about this idea of what was that fallacy you were talking about?
Pre-trans fallacy.
Yeah. So clearly, and this reminds me of like the transcendent function in Jung and the transcendent drive and all of that stuff too. And this transcendent function is like a little bit tricky to define, but it's essentially that it's like whenever the conscious makes contact with the unconscious, there's a new symbol that emerges that is sort of like the distillation of whatever that realization was. And that reminds me of what you were talking about with the pre-trans fallacy too, is that you arrive at these new places and we can use the same word for it, but it's not the same because the phenomenology and the experience of it and the understanding of it has deepened. I'm wondering how some of these big core questions about life, God, reality, how has that stuff metamorphosized for you over the decades of like going in and out of these spaces and playing with different maps? And are there any marked differences in the you from a decade ago to now on these topics?
Yeah, man, definitely. I mean, I think my trajectory has been similar. I can't remember the exact Zen koan, but it's the one where it's like, before Zen, I used to, what was it like, chop wood, carry water. And then during the process, I was like, I was beyond all wood, like I was beyond anything like that. And there was all this kind of, wild kind of deep understanding of reality. And then afterwards I was chopping wood and carrying water again. So you get like that kind of 3-stage process where in a sense, I think initially, maybe like my early 20s, I was very into the metaphysical exploring, through these states and particularly psychedelics, and trying to unravel the mysteries of the universe. And actually, funnily enough, as I say that, I remember the turning point was when I was in Iquitos in 2007 or 8, at this very strange ayahuasca conference that used to happen there. Fucking wild. But I had a San Pedro experience during the day, and then it was at night, and I smoked some weed then at the end of it. I was at night alone in this hostel in Iquitos, which is, if anyone's been there, it's like the darkest place. So seedy.
It's a weird, it's a weird.
So seedy.
I often call it like it's as close to like a Star Wars weird border planet that you're ever going to go to.
Totally. Yeah. I've always thought it would make a great setting for a murder mystery, like a noir murder mystery. It's just it's all underbelly.
They need to do a True Detective season there. That'd be the best.
Shit.
It's like you have like the mystery like lurking on the periphery in the jungle and shit.
Oh, fucking good. Yeah, it would be really good. So, and I had this experience where I was specifically having visions, and there was a kind of central geometric shape that kind of had the secrets of the universe in it. And I was like forcing myself towards it. I was like, oh, I gotta grasp it. And then everything suddenly switched, and I had this sort of what felt like a very, very intense entity encounter of like having a gun to my head. I really felt like I could die. Like it was, and it was like I could kill you right now if I wanted to. And I was like really freaked out. And then it was like, yeah, but I'm not going, but it was kind of mocking me, sadistic. And then it sort of like gave me the thing I'd been searching for as almost like a throwaway, like, here you go. And I was like, wow, and it really shook me. And I asked the shaman the next day, and she was like, no, that the medicine wouldn't do that. That was you. And I was so like peace and love at the time. And I couldn't really accept that. I was like, no, it must have been some kind of external thing. And then I kind of discovered shadow work, and still I was like, yeah. And then about a year and a half later, I just had this moment of sitting on the couch. And I just suddenly realized, I was like, oh, that was me. Oh shit, that was an encounter with a shadow. And then it was this integration moment of, in that sense, integrating a shadow around, sort of around my own arrogance, but then also my own sadism, so deep kind of shadow. I actually got this tattoo because of it.
Oh, really?
So I specifically, I was like, this is so, the shadow is always going to be relevant and important to me. There's never going to be a time I don't have a shadow. Yeah. So and I wanted to get a tattoo anyway. So I was like, so I'm going to get that right on my arm. So that I'm like, don't forget the shadow. Of course, I can't see it, but like at least to be sort of reminded.
Yeah.
And so shadow work became the most transformative, and still is the most transformative work for me. And that shadow work is not the fireworks of metaphysics. And it's mainly in relationship, not on psychedelics. Like it's being married in a 14, 15 year relationship where that's the best teaching you can get, where it's like, challenge, but you have to learn, there's different things to learn. You can't learn, I'm pretty sure Jung might have mentioned this, like you can't get there by just sitting on a mountaintop meditating, because you're just meditating with yourself. You're just getting your own reflection. Not to say you can't really achieve deep insight into the nature of reality. I think you can, but you need relational practices. You need to be in relationship with people. And so then I got really into more of the kind of, inquiry, circling, this process, path of love, sort of a 6-day process, therapeutic, spiritual process. Men's work became a pretty big, important part. I was just in my men's circle yesterday, because it's about being connected and having feedback from people. And I'm not really even particularly good at taking feedback. I am in the sense that I have to grit my teeth. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of sensitive to criticism in some ways. Kind of depends what it is. Like sometimes with my work, I'm not. Like I get, obviously, I have a fairly, I have a decently sized Substack audience. And so, every time I send a thing out, I'm like, oh, this is going to a lot of people. And, you have the same thing, right? It's like, what do you think about it? And YouTube comments are particularly.
Oh, yeah. If you want to understand what shadow projection is, read YouTube comments.
Yes, absolutely.
It's just, not to say that there's zero valid feedback of my work, but the vast majority is just absolute fucking shadow projection by people who,
It's a tricky thing, right? Because there's often a hook to hang it on, and yet the projection can be super fucking intense and way off. And so it's just such a balance, like especially on the internet. And so, some actually, if it's like critique about I missed something, or like this bit didn't really land, I'm just pretty okay with that. And I'm okay with like book editors and things like that. But critiques about me, like all of us, is difficult. But, I find it like it's a practice. I'm like, my impulse is to get really defensive, and I have to hold the impulse.
Right.
And sit with it and sit with the feeling and try and notice that feeling as a defense. Like that is much deeper work than a lot of, I would say that kind of work, which is not glamorous and kind of embarrassing, is also the kind of work I do on psychedelics a lot, or just that happens, right? And it's more important to me than the sort of big, like, oh my God, this is the nature of reality. As incredible as those experiences are, as important as they are,
Yeah.
I've more oriented myself to the gritty work. And now I'm in a space where I'm trying to reorient myself towards the joy and wonder. I'd be like, I'd also don't want to fall into the trap of like continuously working on oneself, because I'm like,
Right.
would also like, I just, I'm a flawed person. I'd just like to be able to be a flawed person who's, having a great metaphysical experience.
Yeah.
Really, like having a trip where I'm not like delving
Right.
into my shittiness. Yeah.
And you've talked about this with Josh Ray, I'm sure, that like the feeling, the need to psychologize everything. Everything's got to be psychology. Every psychedelic trip must have psychological takeaways. And like, but I'm with you in that for sure it should, right? Because there should be some there. I am of the opinion that there should be some cash value to use this. I feel like Sam Harris uses that phrase all the time. The cash value of, there should be some kind of takeaway, right? That creates a new level of understanding, a new perspective in you when you're doing these things. I mean, that maybe that's an innate bias that I have, but on the other hand, too, it brings us back around into this question of like what these entities are, because in that story you just shared, very, very Jungian, very much a part of your own psyche, showing you something that you needed to be shown. But then again, as Tom Cheatham said this to me in that podcast I just did that I briefly mentioned to you, and I think this is a Hillman thing. It's perfectly plausible that there are real beings in the world and real beings in you, right? Like that some of these beings are, and maybe that there actually is no difference, that some of these things that appear in relevant ways to you may be external, may not be. That distinction may just be a flawed distinction to begin with. But in any case, in that story you just told, there was like this functional element to that encounter, this dark, scary encounter, and I want to underline that right there, because all the people who just, again, shadow project into the comments there, like, this is demonic, you're dealing with demons are coming to you. Like, that right there shows, well, this is why, because, and oh man, Tarnas told me this great Stan Groff quote that, Stan said to him personally. He said something to the effect of, when you the trauma that you experience in a psychedelic state is the funeral pyre of that trauma. It's like that needed to be like burned off and fully experienced to be healed. And that's what it takes to heal it. You've got to re-experience it and release it somehow through terror, through something. So that's one possible take, right? But also, I mean, man, I really got the sense through your experiences in the DMT trial that whatever you were experiencing did seem freestanding, did seem like a completely other level of reality, in which it was like an ecosystem that you were just like stumbling into somehow. Yeah. So I'm curious if you've figured out a way around all of that, or if you're just scratching your head on that one.
Scratching my head in a certain direction, right? Because if I tune into this shadow encounter, this kind of encounter with a part of myself, of which I've had others that were, that was probably the most intense, but I've had others that are similar. The sense I have, the qualitative sense, and this is can be very subtle in my experience. There's a meanness to it, like a sense of familiarity of like, it's got a signature that is my unique meanness, and I'm like, yeah, I know that side of myself. If I really am honest with myself, if I really tune into it, I've got that. I've had the reflection relationships. I know it in myself. Yeah, I can be like that. I can be that person. And I'm like, okay. Then I'm like, okay, that's a disconnected part of my own psyche that's being reintegrated, and then the sense of wholeness that comes with it is also really kind of a key. Now, the DMT entities feel this is confusing, right? Generally, DMT entities for me do not feel like that. That's not my experience. I did have encounters where the entity encounter had a lesson about me, and that was really sophisticated and amazing. But the way I described it in the bigger picture of my book is that felt more like I was encountering someone in a marketplace, and that encounter taught me a lot about myself.
Wow.
But in the same way that if I have an encounter in, the supermarket, that really sits with me, and I'm like, holy shit, that's so much insight into me as a person. I really learned something from that. It doesn't mean I imagine the person in the supermarket. It just means we're all in this kind of interconnected flow. So, but the boundary becomes a little bit more harder because it's different in the DMT realm, because there is this sense of, it's a synergy of consciousness somehow. I actually, during an ayahuasca experience, I asked, like, where are you? Because I always have this very dialogue style of kind of experience on psychedelics. It's always a back and forth dialogue with, what I call like the teaching presence of the, whatever it may be. And the answer I got was like, that you kind of have to unask that question. This doesn't really make sense. This experience and this consciousness exists in synergy between your consciousness and the ayahuasca consciousness. And it doesn't make sense to disentangle them in the same way you can't like separate the sugar and the water, the salt and the water. Then now it's a new thing. And I think that is true. I think that is a less dualistic model that feels for me more intuitive. And then at the same time, I've had entity encounters where I'm like, that has no sense of me in it that I can discern at all. Like that is so, not only for me, like, hyperdimensional chinchillas that I was communicating with. I'm like, nah, I don't think that had anything to do with unprocessed psychic material in me that needed to be processed through. It just felt like a completely different type of experience. And I would say that's more common. That is this very different type of experience. But very often there is agency and a message and some kind of relevance to it. And then sometimes it's just like a giant squid entity that is not interested in me. I don't know how to communicate with it. There's just so many like that. So I'm like, okay, well, what are those? Right? We don't know. And the otherness that they have, the sense of other.
They're demons.
They're demons. Oh, sorry. I wanted to speak to that. Stephen Jenkinson, who's fucking awesome. People should check out. He writes about death and dying. I interviewed him once, and he said, pretty sure it was Stephen Jenkinson. Apologies to him if it's not, but I'm 95% sure. He was like, angels and demons used to basically be on an equal footing in a lot of traditions, right? The difference was an angel was an entity that told you something you wanted to hear, and a demon was something that told you something you didn't want to hear. So you don't get people in the comments as much, although I actually have had them under my Instagram videos being like, that's an angel. The percentage of like the fear projection is much stronger than the benevolence projection, which is ironic because most DMT encounters, at least from the literature we have, from the studies I've done that have been more naturalistic, like asking people on Reddit, most of those are benevolent.
Yep.
So the majority is benevolent. And so that's kind of interesting that, I think there's a lot of confusion.
Was that the case in the study that you were a part of? Did any of the participants you know of have any like really dark, really?
No, not that I know of. I don't know. I can't now remember. They gave us so many questionnaires. And if they did ask us about the types of entities, I mean, they definitely asked us about we gave them full phenomenological reports, but someone may do that. Someone may look at those reports and they have the data. It's just that there's so much data that they'll be working on that for years. I'd be kind of curious to find out. From the people I've spoken to, no one had like a sort of like very intense one. And the Rick Strassman's original study in the 90s, he had there's a lot of alien symbolism. There's a lot of like there's someone that had an anal probing experience, but they literally had anal thermometers inside.
Oh, right.
And they were like, they're in New Mexico. So it's like, come on, like you got your anally probing people on DMT in New Mexico and they're having UFO experiences.
You're creating a math. You're basically creating a math equation. Creating a math equation right
exactly.
there. Now that we're back on this topic of the studies, I know that this is sort of like the study you were in was very much a groundbreaking study that feels kind of like the floodgates are opening. And I mean, I'm sure you know about like what's on the horizon with like Noonautics, that organization that Gallimore is working with now, where they're like building this island where like anybody's gonna be able to go do it.
I don't know if they're building an island. This in Jamaica?
Well, no, sorry. They're not like building an island, but they're building a place. They're building like a place on an island. Yeah. So that's going to be that's going to really open some floodgates. But two, they're doing more studies there now. And I know last time we spoke, you were talking about this study that I think you said it was ongoing recently, where it was multiple people having an experience at the same time, right? Where they're trying to see if there was agreement on what was being experienced.
Yeah, and unfortunately, so I don't know. I might be part of that study, but I'm not sure if I'm going to be, because they also had so basically I don't know that much about it, because they did a 5-MeO study, which I did about 2 months ago.
Oh, really? We didn't talk about this.
Okay. I said about that. Yeah, you talked about that. And they really wanted people in the 5-MeO study who'd done the DMT extended state for something to do with that's something because they can compare the data very easily, and that's useful. And I don't know if that's precluded me from doing the other study, or at least at the moment. I need to follow up with them, but I know that was about like seeing if they could sync up people to get kind of with eye gazing and different experiences, and see if they could tell that the other person was also there at the same time, or even if they could potentially encountering the same types of things, which I'm really fascinated by.
Yeah.
But the 5-MeO study, it wasn't the same. I don't want to say too much because the study's ongoing, and I don't want to talk about the protocol too much, but there's aspects of the protocol that I didn't gel with, specifically because it's really looking at ego dissolution, and I have a lot of disagreement around the phenomenology of what it means for the ego to dissolve and what's understood by that. And it's also very difficult. Actually, I can't say that. Anyway, I don't want to get into too much detail, but it had its own beautiful moments, right? And, it's such a different experience. That 5-MeO experience is very non-dual.
Yeah.
And I had this experience, I had this moment in that experience where, to go back to shadow work, I was in a more sort of oceanic, non-dual space. And then my shadow really popped up. I was really with good and evil, right? So my shadow popped up. So it was like full good, full evil.
Wow.
Within the wholeness of being. And I had this moment where I was like, I made the mistake of over-identifying with my shadow, which is something that happens in shadow work, right? And part of my process has been learning to unlearn that and have try and be more aware of that. And so the shadow was coming up, and I was like, okay, all right. I don't want to over-identify with the shadow, and I don't want to over-identify with the light, but I'm in this experience where both the good and the bad, but like the fullness of all of them, like the good and evil were together. It was very Taoist, all one substance there.
It sounds very Zoroastrian too. I mean, this idea that there's an ongoing push and pull and even conflict between, like, there's the Ahura Mazda goodness, whatever, and then there's Ahriman. There's like the darkness that, and they are in an active either conflict or, I think it's conflict basically.
Yeah. And they sort of make even in Taoism, it's not so much conflict, but they sort of imply one another, right, and they kind of make the world through their interaction.
Yes.
And so then as it was going down a bit, then I was really dropping into this philosophical question, which is, I'm certainly not the first person to ask. And I kind of need to delve into, I think, what's a really kind of well-trodden ground philosophically, where I was like, if good and evil are of the same substance, why choose to be good? Right? Like, why not be nihilistic in a sense, right? And the nihilism thing was easier because I was also connected to the wholeness of being. So there was a sense of connection to a vastness beyond me, which was very unnihilistic. But then behaviorally and socially, I was like, I really felt it was important to answer that question for myself. I was like, why should I choose like love? And then it was just like, well, just because choose love. And it was sort of like, there is this kind of thread. Alan Watts has talked about this, like that the good is just slightly more than the dark. And there is actually I think a rationale for that, because if two things imply one another and they're in dynamic opposition, they can't be completely equal to one another, right? Because because one of them has to be different to the other. And if they're completely equal in size to one another, then they're the same. So the good being slightly more than the dark moves the whole thing round, right? And so there was this kind of almost a sense of the thread of like, ultimately goodness is more than just the other side of darkness. There's a kind of there's love in it. There's like a kind of beauty and there's an energy in it. And so like choose love just became this really cheesy kind of thing that came out. And then of course I started noticing like it's quite a common t-shirt. A lot of people have choose love t-shirts. And I was, whether it was synchronicity or I was just more attuned, I've seen like 5 or 6 of them since then, which has been kind of cool.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting that you had this very strong experience of this archetypal, like prima materia, like just unifying substance, and then also that within that substance, a goodness and a darkness sort of coexist. Or I like the way that you put it. They like naturally imply one another. That's like it's very Platonic. It's like very much almost by like examining archetypes, you run into the logic necessity for a reflective archetype to exist just by talking about, I mean, it's the same in math, right? Like you logically imply the existence of other things by positing anything or not positing anything. And one thing that, and this is addressed in a lot of Platonic dialogues, and like the form of the good, for instance, is the highest, most transcendent archetype that naturally, like the sun, gives rise to basically everything else. And there's a few different ways that they discuss the problem of evil in Platonism, depending on like what thinker you're talking about. There's like a thing called the errant cause, and there's also like Plotinus kind of talks about it in terms of like distance from that form of the good, in that like the further, because it's like this emanating first principle, right? But the further that you get away from it, the more like fragmented and fractured and broken up it is, and it's kind of like settling in the bottom of the like cosmic vessel of creation, basically, and we're living way down there. But the fact that you experienced it in such a, I mean, I'm just kind of imagining this like undulating yin yang of forces, and the ugliness here and the goodness and beauty here. That's really interesting. I mean, because it's one of those things that sounds so simple, right? Like, I mean, here we go again with the thing we've been talking about, this pre-trans that it's like, yeah, it's cliche for a reason, because you can really, like, in peak mystical states, you can get to this place where this is a felt real experience. And I'll just say I know of certain very highly thought of esotericists and occultists, some of whom are the very scholars who are actually translating grimoires, like a lot of the old grimoires, and they see and learn so much that they end up going the sort of Zoroastrian route of like, there are these two forces, period. And it's like, and I've translated some of I'm forgetting the guy's name right now, but one of the guys is like, yeah, I've translated some of those and I will not fuck with them. I do think they're real, and I do think there are ways to get in touch with things on that side, and I won't go there. So that's interesting, man. That is very interesting.
Yeah, and I'm just remembering the experience, and there was just like I felt this real sense of calm and relief being in that state, because there's something about I think there's something about like being in the dynamic of sort of yin and yang, good and evil, etc., is this kind of ping-ponging exhaustion. It's like the world of 10,000 things, right? In Zen,
Yeah.
It's like it's Maya. It's the kind of baseline that we're sort of like most of the time perceptually stuck in. And then in those peak spaces, when we can take a step back and for a moment be like, oh, okay, yeah, I have a distance from that and can remember even for a moment that this is a dance that's playing out. Mm-hmm. And then I think what I've noticed in the 5-MeO world, which I'm not really super tapped into, but the non-dual experience, people get very confused, and the sort of guru types there get very disconnected. It's a very kind of disconnected style of like inhumanity that can come from, I think basically misunderstanding that non-duality implies duality as much as it implies anything else. Like duality and non-duality are coexisting.
Right.
And actually what you're coming into is a third perspective which holds both of those. Because if you're not, you're just kind of ping-ponged into the other side, right? And so, and probably that third space is like a fractal. That it's kind of a key. Yeah.
You really just gave me an insight there, because it's like an of course, because just what we were talking about before, like how one thing naturally implies the other. So, and this gets very Pythagorean and Platonic too. Mm-hmm. So the dyad that you're pointing to implies a transcendent monad, right?
Yes, so, it does.
So
exactly.
And then that's where you can't go beyond, right? Because yes. then you just get to this like that's the thing. Like beyond that, and then that also once again elevates like the one or the form of the good to above whatever that, because I think you could argue that you reached the pinnacle of what's possible almost to experience, right? You reached the very binary beginning of like this and that, right? That could like masculine, feminine, light, dark, whatever. And from there, all things can proliferate and emanate out. But above that, there's like this non-thing, this, but it's also like the most basic thing. And that's where it gets into the complete negative theology of like, you can't even talk about this, but you logically know it has to exist in some way.
Yeah. You know what it's reminding me of is, and I never talk about this, but it's actually, I really think it's needs to be talked about. Nitrous oxide.
Oh,
so
yeah.
My deepest spiritual experiences have been on nitrous oxide.
Wow.
By far. And I haven't done nitrous oxide in probably, I don't know, like maybe a decade, right? Or maybe 5 years or something. But there was a time where I was like, sporadically into it and had the canister thing. And like, I think nitrous oxide, for me at least, and for people like William James, and like, I've read a William James quote where he's like, the only difference between differing degrees of difference and non-difference. And I've read it after nitrous and been like, yes, dude, I completely understand what you're saying. And I've read it like weeks later and been like, what the fuck is this dude talking about? Because it's the infinite. It's the thing that cannot be spoken. And it's really the 5-MeO experience, similar, definitely. But I actually think nitrous oxide is incredibly powerful at tapping into the experience of what is truly beyond what is possible to describe. And it's weird because, most of those experiences, if not all of them, have been in sort of recreational festival or party situations. These memories of like kind of coming to on a couch in the deepest sense of blissful calm, of just knowing, but not being able to speak, of a knowing of sort of like, it's all okay because there is infinity inside of us. And everyone else is like partying. And I'm like, I don't even have the need to like talk about the experience. I'm just like, yeah. And it's also kind of crazy that I've just had that experience in this setting. And then it fades really quickly because it's almost like it can't not fade. But there was an imprint of it in the 5-MeO experience. There was a similarity to it. Yeah. And nitrous never gets talked about in the psychedelic renaissance, even though it has this rich history. It's got it's been abused quite widely recreationally in Europe. But it just has really been left out of the whole thing, even though it's quite like, widely available in hospitals too.
Wow. Yeah. I'm remembering now, I talked a long time ago to Peter, I always say his name wrong, Shosted Hughes.
Yeah, that's actually a good pronunciation. Yeah.
He was telling, I remember he was really into this philosopher who was pre all the tryptamines, but was very into nitrous. And he was, I don't remember his name though. I'm forgetting his name.
I wonder.
Um,
Yeah. Peter's a colleague of mine. He's one of the directors of Breaking Convention as well. And I can't remember the name, but he gave a talk about Huxley in the 75th
mhm.
anniversary of Doors of Perception. I don't know if it's the same philosopher, but he was talking about like a philosopher that was around. I think it's the same guy. And he was sort of like not taken as seriously
Mm-hmm.
because he was anyway. But
Yeah,
yeah,
he
yeah,
did something else. Yeah, he was known for
yeah,
something else too. That's right. Yeah, yeah. I'm drawing
yeah.
a blank, but yeah. I mean, it does have this sort of like, I don't know, more recreational, less profound sort of air around it, I guess. But yeah, man, that it made when you were talking, it made me think of the meme of the guy at the party standing in the corner saying like oh yeah, and I made like the perfect meme for this a long time ago. It was one of those memes, and it was something like they don't know they're all just transcendent oneness humping itself or something like
Yeah.
that, because it's all people dancing around him and whatever. Um, yeah, man, that's interesting. That's really interesting. And as far as I mean, that's one you never hear about in terms of like they're doing research on nitrous or they're doing, yeah,
And they could so easily. It just costs nothing, and it's in hospitals already. It's already given to people, so you don't need any. You wouldn't need any special permissions for just have an anesthesiologist and etc. But I think what you would need to do is prime people on some metaphysics.
mm,
I think, well, would you? I don't know. But that kind of undermines the argument I'm making that it's an experience that can be. No, I think it's. I don't think you have to be primed on metaphysics. I think you have to be able to integrate the experience and interpret it in a certain way, because it's like, William James and others have had similar phenomenological experiences on it. So,
yeah,
but there's no money in it. There's no money in researching that, right? Because there's no money to be made from people taking nitrous to heal their metaphysical ailments.
yeah, right,
I don't touch infinity. It's off patent for probably 100 years or something. So,
yeah,
yeah.
man. This has been such a fun conversation again. Absolutely flew by. Um, what do you got going on? The Substack. You said you have a
I think,
new book in the works.
yeah, new book in the works, which is really early in the works and just sort of like in the proposal stage, which is around how AI is changing spirituality. So hopefully more to come on that in the future. But I'm focused on a major new project, getting back into the YouTube and other spaces, which will be happening in November, and I'll be announcing it in September. I can't talk about it yet, but I'm hoping we'll collaborate on that. It's all very mysterious.
Yeah.
It's going to be cool. So but if people want to check out my work, my Substack, which is called The Bigger Picture, where I write about whatever tickles my fancy in the swirling zeitgeist. Put out maybe like 2 pieces a month on there. So yeah.
Fantastic. I need to subscribe to it. I haven't yet, but I absolutely need to, and everyone should. So you just have an awesome mind, dude. Like you come up fairly often when I'm just like talking, just guests come up when I'm talking to other guests. And yeah, I just always am so impressed by the quality of your work and the breadth of your knowledge. And you also have the trifecta in that you're just a lot of fun to riff with. So
thanks, man. I really appreciate that. And likewise to you, man. Like I always come out of these conversations having learned so much.
Likewise,
I'm feeling like right now I'm like, because you and John Vervaeke have been like Platonism or Neoplatonism as maybe that's the same kind of stance. But I'm like right now I'm like I've got to dive in. Like 2 people I respect talking about it. That's like it's a sign I've got to read something. Got to really dive in.
I know, man. I know, and it's such a deep, never-ending rabbit hole, but it's so fun. It's so fun.
Awesome.
All right, brother. Much love to you. And yes, I don't even know what you
man.
want to collaborate on, but the answer will be yes.
That's fun.